When I was growing up, I loved reading choose your own adventure books. And the reason I loved these books was because it really drew you into the story in a unique way. I mean, you would get to these decision points on a certain page, and then it would say, if you choose choice A, flip to page 98. If you choose choice B, flip to page 105. And of course, as a kid, I'm putting my thumb on the decision point page and I'm flipping over to see what happens and then flipping back to the point of decision to make sure I get the outcome that I want. Unfortunately, real life doesn't work that way. Your decisions rarely get the opportunity to be reversed. You don't get to put your thumb on a point in time in the past and redo things. The decisions we make are often permanent and they set us on a particular trajectory of life. Well, Esther stands at the point of no return as she resolves to risk her life by coming before the king unprompted to plead for the deliverance of her people. And she does this by maneuvering with great skill the web of political relationships in the royal court to bring about her desired outcome. But again, there's great risk involved. It's going to take courage. Her plan requires the alignment of so many different variables and factors outside of her control. And yet again, she resolves to move forward knowing the risk. And so the fate of her people ultimately lies not in the casting of lots or the whims of an unstable king or a conniving counselor, but the providence of God, who works hidden in the background. God is the X factor in this story. The author of the story is intricately and deeply involved in the events that happen, even if he is spoken of not directly, but indirectly, through coincidences, through moments of tension, and through surprising reversals. This is Understanding Esther. In Esther 3-4, Haman, enraged by Mordecai's refusal to bow, manipulates King Ahasuerus into decreeing the destruction of all Jews in the Persian Empire. Mordecai's defiance likely stems from his ancestral hostility toward the Amalekites, but it also might signal his loyalty to the king, that Mordecai recognizes Haman is after the throne. When the decree spreads for the massacre of the Jews, Mordecai calls on Esther, his adopted daughter, to intercede, reminding her that God's deliverance is going to come regardless of whether she gets involved, but that her silence will condemn her. And so Esther courageously resolves to risk her own life, which leads to 3 critical scenes in Esther chapters 5 and 6. First, Esther plots to save her people, verses 1-8 of chapter 5. Second, Haman plots to kill Mordecai, chapter 5, verses 9-14. And finally, God plots to humble Haman in chapter 6, verses 1-14. Let's look at each of these episodes. First, Esther plots to save her people. Esther, dressed in royal robes, enters into the king's court without being prompted and gains his favor. The king welcomes her and offers her up to half of his kingdom, and instead of revealing her true request immediately, Esther does something strange. She invites the king and Haman to a banquet. And during the meal, she requests that they attend another banquet the next day, which sets the stage for her true request. Now, Old Testament narratives utilize dramatic tension to prompt deeper consideration by attentive readers. Why does Esther respond to the king's generous offer to grant any request with an invitation not only to one banquet, but to 2? I mean, why not tell her husband exactly what she wants? Why does she invite Haman to the banquet of all people? I mean, wouldn't it be better if she just had an intimate one-on-one conversation with her husband? Why bring in his influence? But as we pay attention to this narrative, we notice a few things. First, Esther adorns her royal outfit, not only as a means of regaining her husband's favor, but also asserting her authority as a queen. And this draws a contrast between her and 2 other characters in the story, Queen Vashti and a younger Esther. Remember, the king summoned Vashti to parade her royalty and beauty before his nobles, all according to his agenda. He also summoned a young Esther to his court and crowned her as a queen. But here, Esther takes the initiative. She enters into the court. She puts on her royal robes. And this signals a shift in her character. She's no longer on the sidelines. She's no longer this trophy wife. She's just tossed to and fro by the waves of fate. But she's an active agent being used by God to influence the future. And so she utilizes both her knowledge of her husband and of the political landscape of the court to set into motion her own plan. The second thing we notice is that she's very shrewdly sowing seeds of doubt in the mind of the king regarding Haman's motives. She knows that the king is easily influenced. We've seen this over and over again. He gets emotional, his counselors give him bad advice, and he follows it to a T. And she also knows that she's likely going to not be able to get through to the king so long as Haman is one of his trusted advisors. Her requests will fall on deaf ears. So she's got to clear the path by getting Haman out of the way. And she does that by driving a wedge between the king and Haman to secure her influence over his. Now, in the ancient Near East, hosting a banquet or a feast was the customary and respectful way to make a request to a king. So she's following protocol. And yet, when she gets this meal together, she actually delays in making her request on the first night. The king asks her, and she says, my request is, and she almost cuts herself off and says, I would like to have another banquet with you and Haman again. It's kind of a strange sequence of events. But we need to pay attention to the subtle difference between her first request for a banquet and her second request. In her first request, she says, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. But in her second request, she says, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do as the king has said. She switches from the singular to the plural. The first time she says, this is a banquet for you, the king. The second time she says, this is a banquet for the both of you, for them. And that begs the question, why does she do this? Well, there's a subtle insinuation that she plants into the mind of her husband. By saying them, she's placing Haman and the king on equal footing, and it's causing some suspicion to arise in the king's mind. Why does my wife want to honor Haman? Why is it so important that he is there? Is there something going on between them? Is Haman coming after my queen? Is he coming after my throne? You can start to see these things bud in the mind of the king, because we're going to see later he has a sleepless night. This is really getting to him. And many of the commentators on this passage note that Esther is essentially maneuvering through the king's insecurity and volatility, and also understanding the pride and ego of Haman. She is maneuvering them together to drive a wedge between them so that she can preserve her people and her request will be heard. Now let's look at this second episode where Haman plots to kill Mordecai. Haman leaves the banquet joyful, but becomes enraged when Mordecai again refuses to bow to him. And so he goes home and he boasts of his wealth and honors, but laments that none of it satisfies him, while Mordecai lives. His wife Zeresh and friends advise him to build a gallows 50 cubits high and then ask the king to hang Mordecai on it. And Haman likes this idea, and so he orders the gallows to be made. What a character study on Haman. You can see his fragile ego. He's very thin-skinned. He leaves the banquet feeling like $1 million, but his day is completely ruined by Mordecai again. He can receive all these honors, but this one guy doesn't honor him, and he devolves into this murderous rage. Remember, the first time that Mordecai disrespected him, he took the indirect route by calling for the massacre of the Jews, and wouldn't it be inconvenient and a tragedy if Mordecai died in that way? But this time, his rage, fueled by his wife's terrible counsel, leads him to a more direct route. Seek the execution of Mordecai. Now, there's a parallel here with the very first chapter of Esther, where the king, following a feast, responds to a sign of disrespect by Vashti, refusing to be paraded before his nobles, and that leads to him issuing a rash decree based on the counsel of his advisors. Well, you see a similar episode here. After a feast, Mordecai, or rather Haman, is disrespected by Mordecai, and then his counselors call him to ask the king to issue a decree, to seek after Mordecai's life. And this ratchets up the dramatic tension of the story. The most powerful players in this narrative are just irrational beasts enslaved by their passions. Rage completely triumphs over reason, and Haman unwittingly sets the stage for his own downfall. And we're going to start to see the reversal of fortune in this next episode in Esther chapter 6, when God plots to humble Haman. That evening, the king can't sleep, and so he orders the royal chronicles to be read, and he discovers that Mordecai once saved his life from an assassination attempt, but was never rewarded. So he wants to correct this injustice. He wants to honor him. And so the king asks Haman what should be done for the man the king delights to honor. Now Haman thinks the king means him. And so he suggests a lavish public display. And the king commands Haman to do just that for Mordecai, humiliating him. And afterwards, Haman returns home absolutely crushed. And his advisors warn that this will mark his downfall. And this sets the stage for Esther's second banquet. Now again, place yourself in the position of the characters. Think about what it would be like to be the king. That night, your wife, who's been a little estranged, hasn't been in your presence for 30 days, insists on inviting your most trusted advisor to a banquet twice in the same week. And she's kind of coy. She's hesitating to share her request with you directly. And you already know of a prior assassination attempt by members of your court to take your throne. There's a lot of things going on. Would you be able to sleep that night? Probably not. Well, his sleepless night allows him to hear about Mordecai's unrewarded noble deed, which sets up the next scene when Haman, quote unquote, happens to enter the court at midnight. Now notice the haste of Haman. His wife tells him, go first thing in the morning and ask the king to execute Mordecai. He can't even wait that long. He's there the night of. He's there at midnight, knocking on the king's door, trying to get in, trying to tell him about this brilliant idea that he has. He's become essentially unhinged and sloppy. And so he speaks with the king, and this dialogue is very, very interesting. Many commentators view the king's question, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor, as kind of a fleece to expose Haman's true motives. The king's a little suspicious and he wants to see what is this going to provoke in Haman. There's a saying, when people show you who they are, believe them. Haman is about to show who he is. Haman responds immediately. It's almost comical. He just says immediately, for the man whom the king delights to honor, and then he lists all these honors that sound like something he probably practiced multiple times in front of a mirror. And as Rabbi Foreman notes, Haman repeatedly uses the word king, and he emphasizes the pageantry and the royalty. And it's like, man, you're saying king a lot. Like, what's going on, Haman? What are you thinking about? And this may solidify the king's suspicion that his trusted advisor wants his throne and his queen. And so the king, in an ironic twist, tasks Haman to give Mordecai, his hated rival, all the honors that he craved. Not only does Haman honor Mordecai, but he also parades him through the streets, proclaiming, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. This is like the worst day of his life. He's got to publicly praise this guy that he just absolutely despises with all the things that he had hoped he would have attained. Now, Haman once again goes home, terrible day at work, and his wife and his counselors say something peculiar to him. They say, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. Now, commentators note that Mordecai belongs to the tribe of Benjamin, the same tribe as King Saul, who famously disobeyed God by sparing the life of King Agag the Amalekite, who is the ancestor of Haman. And here, Benjamin finally gets the chance to defeat the enemy that he failed to conquer in ages past. So God is still telling the same stories, and history is rhyming with itself. And the common thread between all these characters, again, think about Joseph entrusting himself to God, humbly serving Pharaoh and ascending to the heights of power in Egypt. Esther and Mordecai are doing the same thing. And the thread is God's faithfulness, who works in hidden ways through the imperfect lives of his people to bring about his good purposes. And this should encourage us in all of the domains of influence that we occupy. God has placed us in a certain area, in a certain community with certain responsibilities. And so much of our life feels out of control. Things happening in the world, they are out of our control. There are so many variables, and yet we're still called to act courageously in the present, to take risks, to be noble, to be righteous. And we do this by faith, trusting in God's divine sovereignty. There are no coincidences. And the reverses that happen in life are intended by God to show his own faithfulness. And this is a world in which all the powers of the world cannot thwart God's plan. And the power of God in this world works through the weakness of his people to bring about the renewal of his people. And so wherever you find yourself, in whatever position you find yourself occupying, whatever vocation you're in the home, in the church, in the public sphere, whatever it is, God is always at work. And we can look at these narratives and recognize that we live in God's world, that there's nothing outside of his control, and that he is hidden behind our lives, orchestrating all these factors that we can't control for our ultimate good. And he calls us to participate in that, not by knowing the end from the beginning, not by knowing every single detail from point A to point B, but rather knowing his character, knowing the kinds of stories that he tells, and like Esther, choosing to enter into those stories with faith, obedience, and trust.